Today I sit down with the author and executive producer of this podcast, Lennie Grimaldi. Lennie wrote the book Chased, which this podcast is based on. For the next few episodes, I did a wide-ranging interview with Lennie and his experience writing and reporting on this important story that came to define Bridgeport, Connecticut in the 80s and 90s. Chase also had gone where no black undercover had gone before, infiltrating a drug faction of the Gambino crime family. Chase had a gifted communication skill set that allowed the color of green, money, to transcend his skin tone to cynical mobsters. The subject matter was also a sweet spot for me because I had chronicled organized crime families as a young reporter. For people who don't really understand, how dangerous was this time in the city of Bridgeport?
Well, it wasn't just Bridgeport. You're talking about, Bridgeport is a fascinating city in Connecticut. It's Connecticut's most populous city, but it has these urban areas that are smack right up against affluence. You can be in Bridgeport along Long Island Sound, and the next town you get into what they call Connecticut's Gold Coast. Fairfield and Westport and Darien and Stamford and Greenwich, with all these stately mansions and mountain ranges of money. And, traditional organized crime families, be it Italian gangs or drug gangs, there was so much money there. And by the way, we had the crack cocaine epidemic that can make them more money. So there was money to be made. So it was really more of a regional approach. Bridgeport just so happened to be the place where he was born and raised and lived. But the work he did was far beyond Bridgeport, Connecticut. It was the Gold Coast of Fairfield County, the Tony areas of Westport and Greenwich, Stamford as well, being one of the preeminent locations back then for organized crime, particularly led by the Gambino crime family. So he, bit by bit by bit, didn't happen overnight. He just built relationships undercover, as this gifted, silver-tongued drug dealer, right, who can make anybody money, transcending his color. Because, for the most part, irrespective of what you hear about the traditional mob families, they didn't really care as long as there was a buck in it for them. They didn't really care who they dealt with. As long as you're making me money, it's okay. So he was able to, bit by bit, a lot of it, when it came to the work he did in the Gambino crime family, a lot of it was the Stamford, Connecticut area, close to New York City, not that far away.
Talk to me about Joseph Walsh and who he was and why as his sort of reign of the Bridgeport PD. What do you remember about that?
One of my favorite figures in the history of covering law enforcement, talking about someone who had a gift for gab. And someone who was a big fan of Billy Chase's. And when Billy got started, Joe Walsh was chief of the Bridgeport Police Department. He had resigned, or retired, when Billy was still on the job. He was what I call old Irish. They don't make him like Joe Walsh anymore. He came up old school, the old-fashioned way, through the civil service system of the Bridgeport Police Department. It's different structure today. Back then, you took a test and you rose up through the system, right? And he was one of the first to do that. He had a long reign. He was very, very controversial. He was investigated heavily by federal law enforcement agencies, including the FBI. In 1981, there was an aborted sting attempt by the FBI against Joe Walsh, where they had listed this operative to offer him some cash. Walsh turned the tables on the sting attempt and arrested the FBI operative. And with all the work that the FBI did in Bridgeport, one of the few guys they didn't get was Joe Walsh. Clever, intriguing, genius mind, good for a young reporter, for information. One day I wrote something he didn't like, and he iced me. He wouldn't talk to me. I called him, and he wouldn't take my calls because I wrote something he didn't like. It happens, right? So what am I going to do? I got to get to the police chief. I want this information. I want to repair the relationship, and I said, I'll send him a singing telegram. And that was, that did the trick. Back in those days in the early 80s, singing telegrams were a big deal. If you wanted to reach somebody, you just hired someone, they went in and sang a song, and I hired someone to go in Joe Walsh's office and sing a song. And then I got a phone call. Okay, you got me. So, he was a fascinating person to cover.
When you look at this story, although it took place in the 80s and the early 90s, why do you think it's important today with what's going on in policing in our country?
Oh, law enforcement's under assault, under siege. So much distrust, good, bad, or ugly. I think it's a combination of things where today, 2023, you're having law enforcement agencies all over the country having difficulty recruiting men and women. And a lot of cops are retiring early, taking other positions. But the recruitment effort is just not there because of what's happened. So many controversial situations, police abuse against innocent citizens, the lack of training, and that's one of the failures in here. I mean, frankly, even when I was a young reporter, it wasn't hard to figure out that some of those cops could have easily been leg breakers for the mob because the training isn't there, and I think it's starting to catch up, but that's such a key thing. Connections with people. Cops, aren't used to taking a lot of shit from people. And that's the key thing. Like, where does someone cross the line? And part of law enforcement today, you have to roll with it a lot more if you get some pushback from people who, one, are afraid of cops, two, don't trust law enforcement. And to a large degree, law enforcement has given people that reason. I mean, there's so many cases that I've gotten wrong. And unfortunately, the guys and women who do the job are victims in the process. The men and women who do the job correctly are victims of that process. So, law enforcement today has a real challenge. Where is it going to end up? Who knows? But it's a very challenging time for law enforcement, particularly in trying to recruit people to fill a lot of positions that need to be done.
One of the more colorful characters in your book is Mariano Sanchez. I want to read you a passage. No one better symbolized this insanity, the formidable drug problem, and the disdain for authority than Mario Sanchez. He built a ruthless drug machine that scared the daylights out of the west end of Bridgeport. Sanchez patterned his inner city street gang after traditional mafia families. He was the capo, the head of the organization who controlled all of the illegal drug activity through a team of lieutenants, soldiers, and associates who in turn used people's bodies as collateral against snitching. They were number one and let everyone know it, modeling the number one family logo on jackets that Sanchez purchased for his members. Talk about Mariano Sanchez.
So before I took on my relationship and project called Chase, Alone, Black, and Undercover, the book, I was an administrative aide to Mayor Tom Busey, who was mayor of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And Tom Busey took office in 1985. And as we advanced into 1986, crack cocaine was nuts. in a city like Bridgeport, which then was probably, roughly 140,000 people, you had a murder a week. You had, in the mid-late 1980s, 60 to 70 murders a week. Now let's compare that to today. I'm sorry, 60 or 70 a year, I apologize. 60 to 70 murders a year. Now it's like you probably have 15 a year, maybe the high end 20. The drug wars, the fighting, the turf wars, and the crack cocaine. It was just very violent business. There was this church in the West End of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and the pastor there contacted the mayor and said, I'm on a loss because these drug gangs are led by the number one family, and they were outfitted. They had all the clothing they needed. The jackets that said number one family, who we are, and that alone made a statement of who they were and in being in control. But this poor Roman Catholic priest had no peace inside of his own church, and they made life really, really difficult for him and his parishioners. So he contacted Mayor Tom Busey, and I had a conversation with the mayor based on what he was telling him, that internally, the Bridgeport Police Department didn't have the tools to take out this drug gang. It didn't have the tools. It just wasn't there. I said, we need to walk down to the federal building and talk to federal law enforcement officials. Because of my work as a young reporter covering the FBI and the DEA and organized crime families, I had built contacts and relationships with federal law enforcement agencies. I said, why don't you let me make a phone call and we'll go see them. So I made a call, and the mayor and I went to the federal building, and there were 20 members of law enforcement there from a variety of different departments. And, the mayor took the lead and started saying, listen, I got a problem here that I don't think we have the tools to get the job done. And little did I know at that time that I had heard of Billy Chase. I heard only that he was a deep undercover doing work. And the federal law enforcement said, okay, we're going to step up. We're going to help on this. And they did. But that's when Billy Chase worked with federal law enforcement agencies to take out the number one family led by Mariano Sanchez. And it was extraordinary work where he was wired up. And again, his gift for gab got him there. But the Billy Chase, as a result of his work, gave a lot of people comfort because people were terrified. They didn't even want to get out of their homes. I remember the mayor, prior to one of the trigger points of the mayor saying, we need to do something, was a community meeting he had in the West End, right, of that church. And a lot of people from the number one family just showed up and laughed in his face and left human feces and crack cocaine in the bathroom just to show them who was in charge. That's how ugly it kind of got. Or you had the police chief and the mayor there, and they're all just laughing at him, saying, "What are you going to do?" What were they going to do? They couldn't get it done. And so that's part of when Busey said, listen, we gotta do something.
There's a chapter that I think we haven't talked about, and I was reading earlier, titled Rich Druggies, Poor Druggies. Spring 1988, the imposing message on the black and white poster of a skeleton absorbed the eyes of anyone who walked into the classroom of Thomas Miller. Cocaine kills. It strips life down to the bone. Thomas Miller was a 42-year-old teacher who taught a course warning teenagers about the dangers of drug abuse at West Hill High School in Stamford, Connecticut. Sporting a doctorate in psychotherapy, Miller lectured students on human behavior topics such as family relations, sex education, and substance and alcohol abuse in his family life classes. Known as Dr. Miller, he was respected and popular. What else was Dr. Miller doing?
A lot of things he wasn't supposed to be doing. That's, people say you can't make this stuff up, and you don't have to. It just happened. And that's when I mentioned earlier that the work that Billy did was far beyond Bridgeport, Connecticut. It was into Lower Fairfield County, excuse me, where Stamford is located. Stamford's 30 miles north of Manhattan. And there's a lot of influence from New York City into Lower Fairfield County. But yeah, that was an intriguing story when I sat down with Billy about some of the offbeat things that he did. And I asked him, I said, you've done all these big gangs, and like, what were some of the more boutique-y, nuanced work that you did? And that's one of the things he brought up. And he said, this was an intriguing case to work on because, here is this guy preaching, sainthood to people, lack of a better word. That's essentially how to live your life correctly, right? And he's doing the exact opposite. And, Billy, he got some tip-offs about this guy and said, okay, I'll check it out. Not every case Billy worked on led to something that was conclusive. But this was one on a smaller level, but still very, very important message to get out, unveil, and pull back the curtain, and he did.
Did you happen, in the midst of all of this, speak with Billy's parents?
Got to know his parents in the research of the book.
Give me a sense of who they were, and when did you speak to them, before or after his death? Just talk me through that.
Billy came from a real solid family. His mom was the first African-American nurse to work in a Bridgeport hospital. Billy was a black man raised Catholic, and you don't find a lot of them. So he, as a result of that, he was exposed to all kinds of different ethnic groups and was able to roll with it. But my sense of his parents, just very good, decent people. He had nothing but compliments about his parents, and having talked to both of them, thought that, he was structured in a very positive way in his life. I think a lot of young guys, men and women, and when they're 17 and 18 years old, they're trying to find their own way, try to make a statement who they want to be in their life. I think for Billy, in 1981, when he came upon the mob hit of Frank Piccolo in the summer of 1981, had a real impact of what he wanted to do, what he wanted to be. Frank Piccolo was a capo in the Gambino crime family. He was arguably the most powerful underworld figure in the state of Connecticut, and was shot to death by order of the head of the Gambino crime family back then, because he got involved in a lot of different weird cases. He was indicted by the feds for allegedly extorting money from the singer Wayne Newton and Lola Falana, and that brought a lot of publicity onto the family that apparently it didn't want. So at the corner of Main Street and Jewett on 1981, Frank Piccolo was at a phone booth. A van pulls up, people pull out, and blow his brains out. Bullet in his chest was really one that killed him. And Billy, as a young man, came upon that. The aftermath, he just saw a whole bunch of cops and people around, and he was a very young man at that time, and said, I'm thinking about a career in law enforcement. And that stayed with him. And that's one of the things he always spoke about to me, was coming upon the scene of that mob hit. That was not a local story. The hit of Frank Piccolo was a national story. And that was something that stayed with him for a very long time.
How old are you when you write Chased?
34, 33, 34. Yeah, started working on it. Yeah, I'm about 34 years old. Let me think now. Yeah, 34.
So as a journalist and a storyteller, I'll make the assumption throughout your life, there's probably been stories that are more important than others, or stories that come to define you. How do you look at this story in your overall life now as you become an older man? And what kind of effect did it have on your life?
How so easily people can be used, and they don't even know it. There are just a lot of decent people that think they're doing the right thing. You give people a little, they're going to take a lot. They will take as much as you're going to give them. And think about people in your life, people listening, examining their lives. Just go through everyone who's been in their life and say, people will just take what you want to give them for the most part. And that's a very cynical view of life, but I was raised that they're good guys and bad guys. And you know what? I met a lot of people in law enforcement who are just jerks. And I met a lot of people on the other side who just weren't that bad. And they were framed that way because of circumstances, how they were raised, and trying to put food on their table. There's no perfection here. So for me, the tragedy of Billy Chase is a person thinking, I'm in the right place in my life, and they're actually going to have people who are going to have my back. They didn't have his back. And that's one of the things in this tragic story that stick with me forever.
Now, at 33 years old, when you look at things like a book, films, etc., like wine, with age, they can become better. They can have more meaning. At 33, you probably wrote the book for a particular reason. And how old are you now?
64.
So now at 64, is your thinking the same as it was when you were 33? Did you have the foresight to understand what you were actually writing about, or the story you were telling?
Not even close. I hadn't a clue. When you're 33, I had a couple of books under my belt, but nothing that were huge or anything. And for me, I just felt this was a right fit because of my background, having law enforcement journalistic background, and knowing a lot of the different players, and having heard of Billy Chase, but not having met Billy Chase. Billy Chase's story was actually read by the late actor Danny Aiello. He read an article. Danny Aiello is one of the great character actors. And he brought it to the attention of this literary agent named Frank Wyman. And Frank Wyman read the story about Billy Chase and how he had to leave and blah, blah, blah. It was a newspaper article. And he called the desk of the Connecticut Post and said, listen, I think this is a book. Is there anybody in town you feel is a fit for it? So Richard Peck, who was the managing editor, answered the phone and said, well, this guy Grimaldi, he may be a fit for that. And so, I took on the project I wanted to be published, right? But I also wanted Billy to be able to tell his story as well. There was no money in it. People say, hey, you wrote a book. Book writing is a glorious sounding profession, but very few make money for a variety of different reasons. And back then in particular, it's a different world today. You had more publishers, but, publishers take most of it. I've written books independently that have made more money. But back then I said, wow, this is a fit for me. I really wanted to do this. But no, I didn't grasp the full understanding of what this guy went through. It was the process was very organic. I'm sitting here interviewing a black man, I'm a white guy, telling a story from a black man's perspective. Now add on to the stuff that African-American men have had to deal with in their lives and still do. So what I tried to do was, once I decided to write it, we found this publisher. It wasn't a big publisher. It New Horizon Press was willing to take it on. It was a very small advance. I marinated in everything that was Billy Chase. I said, what do you eat? And what music do you listen to? And where do you go? And so I was just listening to his kind of music all the time to try to get into the spirit of, his persona, his being, his interests, doing my own research of things he likes, just to provide that kind of perspective, because the narrative is my words, with deep quotation from Billy, a lot of which was from, wearing a body wire that makes the book an intriguing read. But I only had 90 days to write the book, and it shows. I go back and I look at this book and I go, God, so I think certain passages I nailed, but a lot of it was like, God, really? You really wrote that? But I had to write it in 90 days because that's what the publisher wanted. You got 90 days. If you can't write in 90 days, no deal, because I want to kick this out for the Christmas season. That's what I said, all right, fine. So I disciplined myself to write 1,000 words a day for 90 days. And I came up with 90,000 words that got cut back somewhat, and we managed, to get it out. And, it had some national intrigue. Billy did the Today Show, and the Daily News did a profile on him, and some other, national media outlets as well. But, it was quick, it was done. And then you kind of, what's next? And there were several offers to turn it into, film and movies, and it was optioned several times for films. And I learned that it's really hard putting a movie together, and you've done it. I mean, you've done movies. I mean, you know how to do that. So you would know better than me how hard it is to put a film together. And, people would call up, and I want to do this book, and blah, 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 and put the money together, and, there are all these scripts coming my way, no money coming my way, but then ultimately no one could put the money piece together. There were several name people attached to this book. I really wanted to get it done. Sure, selfishly wanted to get it done, but I really wanted it done for Billy too. Billy wanted it so badly. On a couple levels. He's honest. I'm broke. I don't have any money. Billy Chase didn't have any money, right? With that little pension, he got some jobs here and there, decent jobs. I mean, teaching at a local university about law enforcement and stuff. But Billy didn't live big. Billy did not have a big appetite for things. He didn't go out and spend lots of money. He just didn't do it. If he had a fancy car, he was probably 30 years old and he fixed it up, So it was very workmanlike, the whole process. But, there were times where maybe it'll be something bigger. I'll have an afterlife, be an evergreen project. And then you go, okay, it's time to walk away. And then someone else calls, hey, that doesn't work out. And so after a while, you don't get your hopes up for it to be something. But, when he died, it took on a whole different meaning. When the book was written, it was like, this was kind of like the hero that nobody knew, but I was trying to tell people who wanted to turn it into a film, Billy Chase is not, he's a tortured hero. And you don't frame him as this, heavenly figure. He's not. And he knows that. He's an imperfect human being, a very decent, kind, smart human being. I think too often people are like, oh yeah, this is perfect. He'll be like the Black James Bond or something like that. I go, well, whatever. That's not who Billy was. So But then when he passed away, it came full circle about, I was telling people, this guy, if you're going to do something with this guy, it's just not the heroism, it's the torture, it's the darkness, it's the fear that he lived with every day. And he had very few friends. It's like Billy couldn't go out to the local bar and have a beer. He couldn't do it. It's a life of disguises and accents and changing your voice and, rolling with different personalities. It's schizophrenic. It's a very schizophrenic way to live.
Would you write a different book today?
I think it would be a little bit more in depth, having, more than 30 years now, about 30 years down the road and a different perspective. I would like to have thought that, Billy's book could have been made into something bigger, and there was always that chance. But, I could also see, knowing his relationships, knowing the darkness he felt in life, that it could unravel. I mean, it did.